I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had faced public storms, family fractures, and years of scrutiny, but nothing prepared him for the words waiting inside a sealed Balmoral file. The decree carried the authority of his late mother, and its meaning was brutally clear. Camilla was never to inherit unrestricted access to one of the monarchy's most intimate royal sanctuaries. Charles read the final paragraph twice. Then he lowered the document, and the room went completely silent. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles kept staring at the page, hoping another reading might soften it. It did not. The decree, a written royal instruction setting out a private decision, stated that certain family rooms, personal records, and inherited Balmoral privileges were to remain beyond Camilla's automatic reach, even after he became king. Balmoral was more than a Scottish residence. It had been Elizabeth's refuge, tied to personal memories, and the final chapter of her life. That was why the restriction cut so deeply. It was not merely about access. It was about belonging. Camilla saw the change in him before she knew why. She watched him fold the page, his hands controlled. "What is it?" she asked. Charles did not answer. He placed the decree on the table, removed his glasses, and turned toward the aide near the door. "Leave us," he said. The words were final. When the door closed, the queen consort looked back at him and understood that whatever sat between them had already changed everything. Charles finally told her that Elizabeth's instruction had been designed to survive her death. That detail destroyed any hope that this was a temporary disagreement. His mother had anticipated the future. She had expected him to become king. Still, she had drawn the line. Camilla listened without interrupting, but the hurt in her silence grew heavier. For the monarch, obedience meant enforcing a boundary against the woman beside him. Defiance meant challenging the wishes of the mother whose legacy he had inherited. Then Charles reached the notation at the bottom of the file and froze. Another royal had been informed before Elizabeth died. Someone inside the family had known, carried the secret, and never warned him. He read the name again, slower this time. Shock hardened into resolve. He needed to know why his mother had gone this far, and the person who might hold the answer was someone Camilla would not want him to confront. But the document was only the wound. The deeper pain lay in what it revealed about the three people trapped inside Elizabeth's final boundary. For Charles, the decree was not simply an order from a former monarch. It was a message from his mother, reaching into his marriage from beyond the grave. For Camilla, it was something even harsher, a permanent reminder that acceptance had limits, and between them stood the memory of Elizabeth, whose silence during life now seemed more powerful than any confrontation she could have staged in person. Camilla stayed opposite him, waiting for an answer he seemed unable to give. The king could command ceremonies, approve appointments, and carry the authority of the crown, but none of that made this moment easier. The crown meant the constitutional role and powers attached to the sovereign, yet Elizabeth's private instruction reached beyond public office into family territory. Balmoral mattered because it was not simply another royal residence. It represented years of private tradition, family memory, and a sense of belonging that could never be created by title alone. Camilla finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. Did she really believe I should never belong there? Charles looked down at the folded paper instead of answering. That silence cut deeper than any explanation. The queen consort had spent years moving from outsider to accepted wife of the monarch, but the decree now suggested that one final threshold had remained closed. For her, this was not about rooms or records. It was about whether Elizabeth had ever fully accepted her inside the most private circle of the family. Charles felt the conflict tightening around him. As a husband, he wanted to reject anything that humiliated the woman beside him. As a son, he could not ignore the weight of his mother's final wishes. Then another detail pulled his attention back to the document. The wording separated his authority as king from his rights over Elizabeth's private family arrangements. It was deliberate. She had anticipated that he might one day try to reverse what she had protected. Then, the handwritten notation changed everything. Charles read it once, then again. Princess Anne had been informed of the arrangement before Elizabeth's death. His sister had known. She had carried that knowledge while he remained unaware, and suddenly the silence around the decree felt larger than one private decision. Camilla saw his expression harden. She understood immediately that the pain had shifted from rejection to betrayal. Charles folded the document with slow, controlled movements. He was no longer asking only what his mother had decided. He wanted to know why Anne had been trusted with the truth, while he had been left outside it. To understand Elizabeth's decision, Charles would have to reopen a family memory everyone else had quietly agreed to bury. The decree had not been born from years of vague resentment. It had a beginning, a single fictional night at Balmoral, when Elizabeth watched an argument cross a boundary she considered sacred. Those present later remembered how quickly her mood changed. She did not raise her voice. She did not create a scene. She simply ended the conversation, left the room, and made a decision that would remain hidden until Charles himself was forced to confront it. Elizabeth had already been thinking carefully about the future by then. Charles was pressing for Camilla to be treated without private restrictions once his own responsibilities increased, because anything less, in his mind, would leave his wife permanently exposed to quiet humiliation. The distinction mattered. Crown property referred to assets connected to the sovereign's official role, while private family spaces belonged to a different world of personal ownership, memory, and inheritance. The Queen believed those two worlds should never be treated as the same thing. Charles pushed harder than he normally would. He told his mother that public acceptance would mean very little if Camilla could still be made to feel like an outsider behind closed doors. Elizabeth listened, but she did not bend. She answered with a calm firmness that made the room feel smaller. Acceptance inside the monarchy did not mean automatic ownership of every private tradition. For the prince, that sounded like a warning. For his mother, it was a boundary she believed had to survive sentiment. Camilla then raised the point that changed everything. She suggested altering access arrangements for a private Balmoral room holding personal papers and family objects connected with Prince Philip. The suggestion was practical in tone, but Elizabeth heard something else in it. She closed the discussion almost immediately. The room contained memories tied to her husband, not simply royal material waiting to be reorganized. That distinction turned a difficult conversation into a point of no return. Elizabeth later summoned Anne alone. No wider family meeting followed. No public record was created. Instead, the Queen spoke through a private documented instruction prepared that same evening, setting out that certain rooms, records, and inherited privileges were not to pass automatically through Charles's marriage. Anne understood the weight of what she was being asked to protect. She watched her mother close the folder, push it across the table, and say, "Some things belong to the family before they belong to the crown." The princess accepted the responsibility without argument. She knew that one day her silence might be mistaken for betrayal. Elizabeth had made her choice. Anne had agreed to guard it, and Charles had never been told. Years later, that promise would bring brother and sister face to face, and neither would leave the room untouched. Charles did not summon a committee. He did not ask officials to interpret the document. He went directly to Anne. Behind closed doors, the king confronted the one person who had known enough to warn him, and had chosen silence. What followed was not a constitutional debate. It was a brother demanding an explanation from his sister about their dead mother, his marriage, and a secret that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Charles entered with the decree already folded in his hand. No aides waited nearby. No lawyers stood ready to soften the language. Anne faced him alone, because this was no longer about procedure. A courtier was simply a senior royal household official, but none had been invited into the room. The king wanted a family answer, not an institutional one, and his sister understood that before he spoke. Charles placed the document down between them. "You knew?" he asked. Anne looked at him without moving. Yes. The answer landed harder than anger. He rose sharply from his chair, turned away, and fought to control his voice. She remained seated. To him, her silence had denied him the chance to speak to Elizabeth while she was still alive. He could not challenge his mother now. He could only live with what she had left behind. Anne refused to apologize. She told him Elizabeth had never described the instruction as an attack on Camilla or an attempt to weaken her public role. It was a private, protective decision. The Queen had believed certain family memories should remain separate from rank, marriage, and succession. More painfully, Anne admitted that their mother feared Charles would push her to change the boundary if he learned of it too soon. Charles stared at her. That possibility wounded him almost as much as the decree itself. "She thought I would pressure her?" he asked. Anne answered carefully, but she did not retreat. Elizabeth had reviewed the wording more than once. Each time, she left the central restriction untouched. That meant the decision had survived reflection, doubt, and time. Charles asked the question he had avoided since opening the file. Did Elizabeth distrust Camilla? Anne's answer was devastating. It was not only about trust. Their mother believed some memories could never become transferable symbols of position. A title could pass. Authority could pass. Certain personal spaces, objects, and private histories could not. Charles reached for the decree again. His anger had changed shape. He no longer wanted only an explanation. He wanted to know whether the instruction could actually stop him. Charles had heard his sister's defense, but now the king wanted to know whether a dead queen could still tell a reigning monarch no. A crown can command governments, ceremonies, households, and tradition, but even kings inherit boundaries they did not create. Charles now searched for the one thing that could free him from his mother's instruction: authority. Yet the deeper officials examined Elizabeth's arrangement, the more uncomfortable the answer became. She had designed the restriction not as a public command from monarch to monarch, but as a private inheritance mechanism protected by ownership, trusteeship, and family consent. Charles listened as the explanation narrowed his options. The arrangement had been built through private estate controls, meaning rules attached to personally held property and family inheritance, rather than the public powers of the crown. That distinction mattered, because the king could influence royal policy, ceremonies, and household decisions, yet still face limits around private assets that had been deliberately protected. Elizabeth had not tried to command a future sovereign. She had protected what she considered personally hers. Charles felt the frustration rise. His title could settle arguments across the institution, but it could not simply erase this one without consequence. William watched his father absorb that truth and understood the deeper wound. The prince could see that Charles was not grieving only for Camilla. He was grieving because his mother had expected resistance from him and had prepared for it before he ever knew there was a battle to fight. The advisors made the position even harder. Reversing the arrangement would mean challenging structures Elizabeth had reviewed and preserved deliberately. That would not look like a technical adjustment. It would look like the king had dismantled his mother's final wishes to protect his wife. For Charles, that possibility carried a brutal contrast. Defend Camilla and risk appearing to reject Elizabeth, or honor his mother and force his wife to live with a boundary she never chose. William then noticed another clause. Elizabeth had included a safeguard requiring consultation with another senior family member before sensitive Balmoral privileges could be altered. The safeguard, a protection written into an arrangement to prevent one person from changing it alone, made the intention unmistakable. The Queen had expected pressure after her death, and had designed resistance into the structure itself. Charles picked up a pen. For a moment, it seemed he might sign an instruction challenging everything. William said nothing. His father held the pen above the page, stared at the wording, and slowly placed it back down. The decision had reached him at last. The king could postpone it no longer, because Camilla was about to learn exactly what Elizabeth's decree would cost her. Camilla had survived scandal, rejection, hostility, and decades of judgment. But this was different. This rejection had been written privately, preserved deliberately, and left behind by the woman whose acceptance mattered more than almost anyone else's. When Charles finally explained what the decree meant in practical terms, Camilla did not explode. Her reaction was quieter, and that made the moment far more painful. Charles chose his words carefully. Camilla could still accompany him to Balmoral, still enter the estate as his wife, and still share normal family occasions there. But certain private rooms, confidential records, and inherited privileges would remain outside her automatic access. Those privileges meant rights attached to private family ownership rather than public royal rank, and that distinction made the restriction almost crueler. She was not being banished. She was being told that some parts of Elizabeth's world had never been intended to become hers. Camilla listened until he finished. Then she asked the question he had feared. "Do you agree with her?" Charles answered quickly at first. No. But when he tried to explain further, his certainty weakened. He could reject the pain behind the decision without knowing whether he had the right to destroy the boundary itself. The king admitted that overturning it would mean dismantling something his mother had deliberately protected. Camilla heard the hesitation more clearly than the denial. To her, that pause was already a choice. She told him that obedience could hurt just as deeply as agreement, especially when the result was the same. Charles tried to answer, but she stopped him. Years of public acceptance suddenly felt fragile beside one private instruction that had survived Elizabeth's death. Then Charles told her about Anne. Camilla went still. The knowledge that the princess had been trusted with the arrangement before Elizabeth died changed the meaning of the silence. This had not been one forgotten instruction buried in paperwork. It had been known, guarded, and carried forward. For a moment, anger seemed inevitable. Instead, Camilla surprised him. She told Charles not to fight his mother's memory on her behalf. She would not allow him to tear apart Elizabeth's final arrangements simply to prove loyalty to her. The queen consort rose, walked toward the door, then turned back once. "If you tear apart what she left behind for me, everyone loses." Charles said nothing. She left before he could answer. Her surrender should have ended the battle, but instead, it forced Charles to confront the one person whose future would outlive every grievance in the room. The turning point did not come through lawyers, advisors, or palace strategy. It came in a private conversation between father and son. Charles and William spoke without officials between them, without documents on the table, and without the language of monarchy to hide behind. For the first time, Charles admitted what truly shattered him. Not that Elizabeth had restricted Camilla, but that his mother had expected him to misunderstand why she did it. William listened before he answered. He knew his father was trapped between two loyalties that could not be measured against each other. The wife standing beside him now, and the mother whose memory still shaped the monarchy around him. The prince understood that inherited office meant the public role passed from one sovereign to the next, while private family memory belonged to a more personal world that rank alone could not claim. That difference had become the heart of Elizabeth's decision. Charles finally said what he had avoided admitting. He felt judged. The decree seemed to tell him that his mother had feared his love for Camilla might overwhelm his duty to protect certain boundaries. That thought hurt more than the restriction itself. The king had spent years trying to reconcile private loyalty with public responsibility. Yet now he was confronting evidence that Elizabeth believed the conflict might survive even after her death. William chose his words carefully. "You don't have to choose between them." Charles looked at him for several seconds. The future king did not tell his father that the decree was painless or fair. He told him something harder. Accepting it did not mean agreeing with every emotion behind it. It meant accepting that Elizabeth had the right to decide what happened to what she considered personally hers. Charles lowered his eyes. "Perhaps I already did, by refusing to understand." That admission changed the room. The monarch finally saw the distinction that anger had hidden from him. Elizabeth had never tried to strip Camilla of public rank or reduce her place beside him. The Queen's institutional position, her official standing within the monarchy, remained untouched. What had been protected was private legacy, family rooms, personal records, memories, and inherited privileges that Elizabeth believed should never become automatic rewards of title. Charles made his decision there. He would not overturn the arrangement. He would explain that choice personally to Anne, and then to Camilla, without hiding behind advisors or procedure. William understood what that meant. His father was no longer trying to defeat the decree. He was choosing to live with it. But private acceptance could not remain private forever. Charles had finally made peace with the decree inside the family. But outside Balmoral, the story was about to acquire a life of its own. Once the Balmoral restriction became public, the private distinction Elizabeth had fought to preserve disappeared beneath a storm of headlines. Some saw a final act of royal protection. Others saw an unmistakable judgment on Camilla. But one image came to define the moment: Charles arriving at Balmoral beside his wife, both composed, both carrying the knowledge that parts of the estate around them remained separated by a boundary drawn years earlier. Charles had already accepted the decree in private, but public exposure changed the pain. The king now watched a deeply personal family decision become national argument. Palace officials resisted attempts to turn it into a constitutional crisis, meaning a dispute about the legal powers or structure of the monarchy. They stressed that Camilla's public position remained untouched, while Elizabeth's restrictions concerned private inheritance and family arrangements. Yet that explanation did little to quiet the emotion surrounding the story. Camilla understood the danger immediately. She refused to demand a public defense, and told Charles that anger would only make the wound deeper. The Queen Consort knew that every forceful response could be read as proof that Elizabeth had been right to protect the boundary. For him, restraint was harder. He had finally made peace with his mother's intention, only to see strangers reduce it to humiliation, rejection, and betrayal. Then one fictional newspaper front page captured the entire storm. Elizabeth's last Balmoral line appeared above an image of Charles and Camilla arriving in Scotland. The headline spread quickly, because it turned a complicated private distinction into something brutally simple. There was a line, Elizabeth had drawn it, and Camilla remained on the other side of part of it. A national broadcaster shifted the debate soon afterward. Rather than describing the story as Camilla banned from Balmoral, the report framed it as a clash between royal rank and private family inheritance. That distinction mattered. It reminded viewers that becoming Queen Consort did not automatically transfer ownership of every memory, room, record, or personal tradition connected to the previous monarch. The argument changed almost at once. Charles felt the weight of that change when he reached the Balmoral gates. He stepped from the car first, then stopped. Instead of walking ahead, he waited. Camilla joined him. The king did not make a speech. He did not challenge the decree. He simply entered beside his wife, accepting both her place at his side and the boundary that would remain beyond them. The world had chosen its headlines, but Charles still had one final decision to make, and it would determine what Elizabeth's decree ultimately meant. In the end, Charles did not destroy the decree. He did not challenge Anne, rewrite the Balmoral arrangements, or ask Camilla to fight for privileges Elizabeth had deliberately withheld. Instead, the king made a choice more difficult than victory. He accepted the boundary. What had first felt like his mother's final rejection slowly became something else. A lesson about the difference between love, entitlement, inheritance, and the parts of family history even a monarch cannot command. Charles made the decision formal. Elizabeth's Balmoral restrictions would remain intact, ending the family dispute before it could become a deeper fracture. The arrangement governed her private legacy, the personal rooms, records, possessions, and family rights she had chosen to protect, not Camilla's public position beside him. That distinction mattered, because the queen consort would remain his wife, his partner, and a senior royal figure. One closed part of Balmoral would not erase everything else she had become. Charles told Camilla that accepting the decree did not make the pain disappear. He apologized for asking her to live with a boundary created by someone whose approval had mattered so much. She listened quietly, then gave him the answer he had not expected. Camilla told him she would rather live with one closed door than become the reason he tore apart his mother's final arrangements. The king understood then that her restraint was not surrender. It was a choice to protect him from a battle that could never truly be won. Charles met Anne once more. This time, there was no accusation in his voice. He admitted that Elizabeth had understood the danger more clearly than he had. Once private memory became confused with royal entitlement, nothing remained truly personal. Anne heard the change immediately. She had spent years protecting their mother's instruction, and now her brother finally understood what she had been guarding. Anne placed the original decree in Charles's hands. He read it again, but the anger was gone. Then he closed the folder, placed it carefully inside its case, and looked at his sister. Mother's wishes stand. Later, Charles took Camilla's hand without explanation. No argument remained. And so the decree that first shattered Charles ultimately did not divide his reign. It taught him where kingship had to stop, where family memory began, and why Elizabeth's final boundary could be painful without being destroyed. The matter was settled, the marriage endured, the decree remained, and Balmoral kept the line its late queen had chosen to protect. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.